Sean, first let me say this. These allegations are completely false and misleading. But more than that, it hurts me personally because, you know, I'm a father. I have one daughter. I have 5 granddaughters, and I have a special concern for protection of young ladies. This is really hard to get on radio and explain this, and these allegations are just completely false.
Good morning and welcome to AM Joy, and happy Veterans Day, by the way. Alabama's Roy Moore is denying allegations of sexual misconduct and making it clear he's not dropping out of the race for Jefferson Sessions' old Senate seat. Just moments ago, Moore arrived at a Veterans Day campaign event outside of Birmingham. He was greeted by chants of "No more." We will keep an eye on that and let you know if he addresses the allegations against him. Now, this is Moore's first public appearance since the Washington Post told the story of a woman who says Moore initiated sexual contact with her when she was a 14-year-old girl, and he was a 32-year-old assistant prosecutor. 3 other women also told the Post that Moore pursued relationships with them when they were teenagers, and he was in his early 30s. NBC News has not independently verified that report. Now, many Republicans say that Moore should drop out of the race. Quote, if the allegations are true. And how would that be determined, I wonder? The White House offered this response.
Like most Americans, the president believes that we cannot allow a mere allegation, in this case one from many years ago, to destroy a person's life. However, the president also believes that if these allegations are true, Judge Moore will do the right thing and step aside.
Joining me now is David Frum, senior editor at The Atlantic, Kurt Bardella, former Breitbart media consultant, and National Republican consultant Caton Dawson. David, how did we get to the point here where there was even a question of how to respond to allegations of sexual misconduct against a child?
We have this conceit that there was some better time in the past. Just let me remind you, Denny Hastert was Speaker of the House of Representatives, and I think what we are actually seeing are not lowering standards of behavior, but improving standards of morality.
How do you mean? I
mean that a lot of things that we take these kinds of behaviors more seriously today than ever before. That's a welcome change. But I don't think people are behaving worse. I think people are being held to a higher standard, and that this may be, you know, one of the things I try to cheer myself up with a lot is maybe there's some gifts from the age of Trump, and standards. Intensifying social condemnation of cruelty and bullying and sexual predation. This may be something that we are going to take out of this period as a gift.
Yeah, we'll see about that, because I think in some ways, people, if they're not acting worse, they're showing a rot in American culture that maybe was there all along. Maybe to your point, we're just sort of now excising it, right? Maybe we're lancing this boil that maybe was already existent. But let me let you listen, Kurt, to an Alabama voter who's reacting to these claims against former Judge Roy Moore. This is an Alabama voter, Republican.
What strikes you as suspect about the allegations?
The timing. A lot of that is going on right now, and people that are against him are really against him. And I don't think they'll stop at anything to try to keep him out.
And not presuming that that woman reads Breitbart.com, but there is a faction in American politics that you're very familiar with, Kurt, that is pushing people that if they have such a conspiratorial belief that makes them discount these women, they would like to encourage them to keep having that belief. This is Steve Bannon talking about Moore, and this is last night at an event in South Carolina.
Judge Moore said today that they're finding some collusion going on in those stories about Judge Moore, right? You know, is it just a coincidence that the Bezos, Amazon, Washington Post did the Billy Bush hit, and they did the hit on Judge Moore? Yeah, just a complete random thing in the universe, right? Judge Moore, I'm standing with him.
I mean, we have a systemic encouragement of people to believe conspiracy theories over the stories of little girls who had sexual predation practiced upon them.
Well, and I think it stems a lot. Look at the person who's in the Oval Office right now. He spent a lot of time perpetuating a conspiracy theory that President Obama wasn't born in this country and created a whole spectacle around that conspiracy theory. I think in a lot of ways what we're seeing is so many people believe that when Donald Trump got elected, that was their signal that they could actually show and reveal their true selves, and some of this awfulness that we're seeing right now is very symptomatic of that. There's no accountability, there's no facts. No one cares about whether something happened or not. They care about the timing. That's what they're drawing people towards. That's what Steve Bannon was talking about last night. It doesn't even matter if it happened to him. It matters that, well, the timing is suspicious.
Yeah.
Why aren't accusations like this the end of the conversation?
Yeah.
Like, someone might have answered, by the way, to Steve Bannon. Is it a coincidence that the people you support all turn out to be sexual predators?
Yeah. Milo, Trump. This guy, it's an interesting thing, very interesting question. You know, and beyond that, Caton, not only do you have people sort of stoking this conspiratorial mindset among Republicans, in this case in Alabama, who think that the only reason there would be these allegations that people are out to get Judge Moore, you also have this hostility toward the accusers. The same people who really love the Harvey Weinstein story instantly believe those women, as they should, believe the accusers against Bill Clinton, instantly believe them. But when it comes to the accusers of Roy Moore, this is what a state representative in Alabama, his name is Ed Henry, this is what he said about the accusers. He said this: if they believe this man is predatory, the accusers are guilty of allowing him to exist for 40 years. I think someone should prosecute and go after them. You can't be a victim 40 years later, in my opinion, unquote. What is that? What kind of, I mean, that is a rottenness in the spirit, Caton, but it's also a tribalism among Republicans that is, well, you explain.
You know, I'm not going to try to explain a local legislator in Alabama. I can tell you that the voters in Alabama are probably going to decide the validity of these claims or the character of Judge Moore. All what I have found with my calls into Alabama yesterday and this morning is I have found a uniqueness about the voters there that all of the Harvey Weinberg, the House of Cards guy, all of this is so distasteful, upsetting that people are starting to turn some of it off, and that may be wrong, but there's so much out there right now that's wrong. There's so much bad going on that certainly the courts are going to get it, the prisons are going to get the rejects, and it's all going to come to fruition. But it's all out there right now, and our society is all out there right now on right and wrong and things that are going on. This incident with Judge Moore feels more to me like Larry Craig and Anthony Weiner than it does Bill Clinton or Harvey Weinberg. It feels suspect at certain times. I get that there's an election right now. I get that people with President Trump and everything around it, but my point is there's so much out there, Joy, that there is a sense that the people are just trying to turn it off. It's hard to deal with, and it's hard to understand and fathom. So I think that Judge Moore probably wins. I think that the voters of Alabama are tired of all what one told me this morning was outside noise. They'll deal with their own problems. In the long run, we'll see how it works out. But again, I tell you, it feels more like Larry Craig to me, who ended up resigning, than it does some of the others. That's what it feels like to me.
That sounds like outside agitators, when people in the same region were saying that people who were coming down to the South to argue for civil rights for African Americans were just outside agitators and they needed to deal with it themselves.
You know, that Ed Henry quote actually reminded me of something that Judge Moore said in his interview with Sean Hannity. He characterized the older girls with whom he'd had these associations as good girls. It's good girls, because now they were the ones who had been explicit that he had not had a sexual, they had not had intercourse. I think the reveal of Ed Henry and that is how the structure, you're seeing the structure of rationalization in Moore's mind. How does he explain to himself what he's done? Well, there are good girls whom he did not bother too much. And then there are the bad girls whose fault it was.
Whose fault it was. And let's actually listen to Roy Moore a little bit. He was talking with Sean Hannity on his radio show yesterday. And we're watching, by the way, this event that he's at. And if he says anything interesting, we will bring it to you. This is Judge Moore trying to parse dating these good girls, as you just call it, that are teenagers when he's in his 30s. Let's listen to Judge Roy Moore.
Would it be unusual for you as a 32-year-old guy to have dated a woman as young as 17? That would be a, 15-year difference, or a girl 18. Do you remember dating girls that young at that time?
Not generally, no. If I did, I'm not going to dispute anything, but I don't remember anything like that.
I mean, that is not very definitive, Kurt, but I wonder if there is, are we seeing a cultural problem here? Because there is, as a part of the movement that brought Donald Trump to power, part of the movement, this sort of, quote, alt-right, not only is there a good deal of anti-Semitism and racism and xenophobia in it, but there is also a component of it that is against women being too liberated and that wants women to be put in their place.
Right.
And does that also go along with this idea of grooming good girls by making sure that they, I don't know, is there something in it that is also...
I think David hit on a very interesting point there, which is the idea that when you're seeing in some of the rhetoric from these people in Alabama that, well, maybe some of these women are actually, to blame. They played a part in it. Roy Moore is a good guy who was just hanging out with good girls. And that, again, that raises the point. Well, if there's good girls, there must be bad girls. And if that's the case, then whatever happens must be their fault. I think that there is this culture of the lack of empowerment of women, that they fear the empowerment of women, and that they look to normalize this type of behavior because it can't possibly be Roy Moore's fault. One of their own, someone who also, again, embodies racist tendencies, who is xenophobic, who is homophobic, and now you add potential child molester to the rack. They have to find a way to rationalize standing by him, not backing away from him, and this is their way of doing it, and going so far as to even invoke the Bible as a rationalization of this is okay, that somehow, well, Jesus and Mary and Joseph were of different ages, and that somehow makes this okay. I would like them to produce that birth certificate to verify those ages of Mary and Joseph, by the way.
Well, and by the way, their own theology suggests that Mary was a virgin all her life, which means ipso facto she was not having sexual relationships with Joseph, whatever his age. So they are apostates in their own supposed beliefs.
Look, median life expectancy in the Roman Empire was 26.
26.
So obviously most of the people having sex would be under 26.
Yeah, it's really strange. You do have a few people pulling away, Caton, from Judge Roy Moore, not many. But I find it interesting. You have Mike Lee, who tweeted that he is withdrawing his support for Judge Moore, having read the detailed description of the incidents as well as the response to Judge Moore in his campaign. I can no longer endorse his candidacy for president. You had Mitt Romney tweet out, innocent until proven guilty is for criminal convictions, not elections. I believe Lee Korfman, her account is too serious to ignore, worth it to unfit for office and should step aside. Okay, but so now that he's an alleged child molester, they're willing to walk away. But when he was saying that homosexuality should be made illegal, that gay people essentially should be criminals and thrown in prison, they were okay with it. Judge Roy Moore defied the Constitution, got thrown off the bench. He was disgraced and tossed off the court. He was okay then. There's an ongoing issue of the morality of having supported him in the first place. No, Caton?
I don't think so. I think Judge Moore got elected twice. He lost 2 races for governor. I think that in Alabama it doesn't matter. They don't know who Mike Lee is. They maybe hear from Mitt Romney and maybe hear from John McCain. From what I talk to the people in Alabama, Alabama's going to make a decision between 2 candidates. Judge Moore's not going to drop out. The call I got in today, I asked, first thing they gave me was West Point graduate, judge, so-and-so, such and such, and I was a little shocked. The pushback came really quick. Again, and I'm not exactly an outsider to my friends in Alabama. So I heard all the other rhetoric on the show this morning. The people in Alabama are going to have to make this decision on whether the allegations make them not vote or stay home. That's the problem, Judge Moore.
Very quickly, hold on one second, Kate,
sure.
And then I'm going to come back to David in a minute. Then would it be fair for the rest of the country to make a judgment about the Republican voters of Alabama? Daniel Dale, the reporter from the Canadian Reporter, went through and he asked people, and there were people who literally said, even if it's true, even if he raped a 14-year-old girl, I don't care. I would rather have a child molester in there than a Democrat. Would it be fair for the rest of the country to look askance at Alabama Republican voters if they literally don't care if he, in fact, committed sexual assault against a child?
I don't think that's fair, Joy. I don't think they're making that whether they don't care. Well, that's one person, Joy.
Even if it's proven. Daniel Dale talked to official after official after official. He went through and couldn't find anyone who would say, yeah, I would walk away from it. People were literally saying, I don't care.
But let's say a word on behalf of the voters of Alabama here, because they were confronted with a terrible choice, and this is a Republican Party structural problem. Look, the Republican Party of Alabama had been gripped by a terrible sex and corruption scandal before with the last governor.
Absolutely.
The Mitch McConnells and the responsible people chose someone closely associated with that governor. Instead of wiping the slate clean, saying we need to find some new faces with clean records, they said our response to this terrible scandal in the state of Alabama is to come up with exactly the approach they've taken at the national level. We never clean up. We simply give people more of what
they've already had.
More of what made them sick the last time. So at that point, I mean, Roy Moore, who is a local oddball, who doesn't tend to win, a lot of elections, doesn't have a lot of supporters in the state, who is a notorious local character, he at least is different. If you give voters bad choices, don't be surprised that they then you give them a bad selection. Don't be surprised they make a bad choice.
They have other choices, and I want to just let people know that we have Judge Roy Moore, former Judge Roy Moore, in the screen. It's at the left side of what I'm looking at the screen. He's just thanking right now. He's thanking. He's having different veterans of foreign war stand up and be acknowledged. When he gets to the relevant part of his speech, we're going to go. But I'm sorry, Kate, and I interrupted you. I'm going to let you finish your thought.
Well, at the end of the day, Joy, you and I talk about who you elect matters, how you elect them matters, but the voters get to have their say. That's about a democracy, and Alabama's going to make their choice. This is a state that brought us George Wallace on numerous occasions. This is a state with a historic past that is very like most southern states, very independent, very, very serious about their elections. I suspect a lot of people will turn out, and we'll see what they say. I don't think it's fair to judge the entire state of the Republican Party by this one election, but then again, who we elect matters, and we'll see what happens. But
No, I'm sorry. Go on, finish.
Go ahead. I'm fine, Joy. I'm good.
No, because I think at a certain point, and Republican friends of mine, Kate, and you are Republican friends, but I'm talking to people who are saying, I don't recognize my party, that I have a party now whose standard bearers are of the ilk and of the character level of Donald Trump and Roy Moore, and that this is now becoming standard issue, and that Republicans writ large will not walk away from these people, will not wash their hands of this kind of person of low character. This is the party that used to claim to be the party of moral values. And it is now the party of Roy Moore and Donald Trump. Do people feel proud of that?
Well, I mean, it's also the party of Mike Pence and Mitch McConnell and a whole lot of other
these same people.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I mean, there's a democracy out there, and the voters are going to get to have their say, and then we deal with who comes to Washington. Again, if this thing turns out to be egregious as some of the people are making up, then certainly Judge Moore won't stay there for long, but I think he's going to get his chance to serve as a United States Senator. I do.
And Kurt, do you think that then the party recognizes, do people inside the Republican Party recognize that they can only shrink from here? If this is who they are, they cannot grow.
Right. Well, they have boxed themselves in. The moment that Donald Trump became the Republican nominee and every Republican stood by, clapped like a seal, endorsed him, didn't distance themselves from, didn't say this is not the Republican Party we want to represent, because they were so worried about winning one election that they were willing to sacrifice maybe the next 2, 3, or 4 down the road. I can't help but notice that even though Roy Moore had said some pretty ignorant, racist, homophobic stuff before, that they all still endorsed him, that they all stood by him. They were willing to fund his general election campaign. It took potentially molesting a child to get some of these people to walk away from that, but they didn't stop them from getting behind them before all of that stuff happened. No wonder people think this is the party that is racist, this party that is ignorant, this is the party that doesn't care about minorities or gun violence or people dying. The track record speaks for itself, and this party is completely moved away from the quote-unquote moral fiber, moral core that they used to prop themselves up on. It showed that it really was just for show and not something they really corely believed in.
And yet, David, they've been quite successful electorally.
Yes and no. Yes and no. The Republican Party looks very successful right now. I mean, if you look at the map, it looks like the best year since 1928. The Democrats are having their worst years for Reconstruction. But I'm about to release a book on this, and I've been looking more closely at this. When the last time the Republicans were this dominant, back in the 1920s, they were dominant in also all of the major cultural centers of the United States. In 1924, Calvin Coolidge wins 55% of the vote in New York, the financial capital. He wins 65% of the industrial capital, Pennsylvania. In the new economy of Michigan, he wins 75% of the vote. Today, wherever a product is invented, wherever a song is written, wherever a new idea is born, that's where the Republican Party is absent. And so, although they flipped the coin and it landed on the edge, congratulations, I think there's a structural weakness here that is going to become extremely apparent. Well, it's becoming apparent in Virginia in 2017. It'll be apparent nationally in congressional elections in 2018. You have to build, this is the party of enterprise and business. It has to be strong where the new economy is.
Yeah, and I can't quote the statistics exactly, Kate, and we're still listening to Judge Roy Moore. We're waiting to hear for him to say something interesting. But just sort of as a rough estimate, say something worth listening on TV. As a rough estimate, Kate, you know, Donald Trump dominated in, let's say, over 2,000 counties, but they represent maybe a third of the gross domestic product of the country. Hillary Clinton only won, you know, maybe 500 counties, but they represent 2/3 of the GDP of the country. The Democrats are weak when you know, as David said, when you look at the map. But if you look at the places, you know, where industry is happening, where innovation is happening, you know, they're for all intents and purposes, the Republican Party isn't even there. They're not growing in the industrial centers of the country, in the creative centers of the country. They are owning essentially the rural parts of the country and then demanding that we bring back coal. So I wonder if existentially the party has taken a step back and said, okay, gerrymandering can keep us in power, but where do we go from here? Where do you think the party is going with this? You can't, the country doesn't want this.
Well, I disagree with that, because when I look at the elections for the last 8 years of Barack Obama, we gained seats in the House and Senate all over the country. We gained governorships with the party of individual responsibility, the party who wants to create growth and jobs.
Wait, hold on one second. Individual responsibility?
Well, and this is where we're going to judge everybody that's a politician. Now, mind you, this thing cuts both ways in both parties, this morality issue and this sexual issue. You can't just judge a party by one person. There are a whole lot more people. So my answer to you is, with all the demise the last guy just gave us, all the demise, the elections and the people that are voting have been putting Republicans for 8 years in office. Now, with that said, Virginia, I get Virginia. We didn't win Virginia. We haven't won it in a while. And so that wasn't like losing South Carolina or losing North Carolina. So we've been winning elections, especially the local elections that matter to me more than these national elections. We've been winning on a pretty fast clip. And so whether they're rural Americans or urban Americans, they both have the same vote. So I get the theory of maybe they're not coming from these bases, or maybe we're not progressive enough, but we're attractive enough to where the voters are voting for us.
Well, the voters that are showing up, I mean, that's the problem too, is that the voters in the industrial heartland, right? I mean, you know, the rural voters show up. I'll give them that.
Caton makes a powerful point, and it's the thing I agreed with this at the opening of the show. If the rule is that how a politician treats his or her intimates, if that's an important consideration how to vote, that rule has to be applied pretty broadly. And in fact, that has not been the rule in American politics until the day before yesterday.
Yeah.
And I'm not a big believer in whataboutism, but the story of Bill Clinton is an example of this, that 15 years ago, 20 years ago, people say that that's not relevant, how you treat your intimates. And if today we're going to say, you know, it is relevant, and again, I'm not sure it's exactly the right political standard, but that's a new thing, and that's a higher standard. It isn't that our culture is rotting. G.K. Chesterton used to say, it isn't that the world is worse, it's the newspapers are better. And I think there may be something going on here that, and as the process of achieving real as opposed to legal equality for women has been a very slow one. That's not the way the human race has been for 50,000 years. Working that out, what does it really mean that women are people? What does it really mean? And that means that how you treat them, just as how you treat your staff tells us what kind of leader you'll be, how you treat your wife and your children, or your husband or your children, or your parents, those things also tell us. But that's a new standard. I think it's basically a welcome standard.
Yeah, but not
it's a new standard.
Yeah, and I should also note that to Caton's point about winning elections, you know, if the Republican Party truly believes, Kurt, that they've got it over the Democrats on ideas and values, then why are they working so hard to prevent people of color from voting? Why the active, aggressive voter suppression? Because part of the reason that it's the rural voters who show up is that the door is open to white voters, and Republicans keep that door open, and then they subsequently and simultaneously keep on trying to shut the door on the kind of voters who want to vote for the party of the urban centers, the party that's voting in the innovative centers. They're not exactly just leaving their thumb off the scale and then saying, let's see whose ideas win.
I think that they're very concerned that really what happened in California will happen nationally. You know, 20 years ago, California was a Republican state. We had a Republican state legislator, we had a Republican governor who was looking at potentially running for the White House. And over time, as the party moved further to the right and really got hijacked by the conservative right, the party withdrew. And now you have a supermajority for the Democrats in the state legislature. You have Democrats in every state constitutional office because the Republicans could not. There are elections where they can't even field a Republican to run in the general election anymore, where it's just Democrat versus Democrat. Republicans naturally are terrified that they're going down that path.
Yeah, but they're also doing, because I want to bring in Karine Jean-Pierre. Karine Jean-Pierre is a senior advisor for MoveOn.org. I want to also add Frank Schaeffer, and he's the son of the famous evangelical leader Francis Schaeffer and the author of Letter to Lucy, a manifesto of creative redemption in the age of Trump, fascism, and lies. That's a hell of a title right there. Heck of a title, I should say. And on the phone, sorry, it's not Sunday, but Bishop William Barber, who's president and senior lecturer of repairs of the breach. I'm going to start with Karine first because you know, we're talking about this question of, oh, whoa, sorry. Okay, well, I think we're not going to start with Karine. We're going to have. Let's go to Reverend William Barber first. I'm sorry. Got a little bit of confusion there as to what guest was where. But Reverend Barber, we have this question about which party is sort of the party of moral values. You have Roy Moore standing up there as a self-described sort of arbiter of the values of the country. And yet, I don't know. I haven't seen too many evangelical leaders walking away from him, even as he faces these allegations of sexual misconduct against a child. What do you think is going on?
Yeah, well, first of all, Joy, I heard a lot of what your panelists have said today. See, true Orthodox evangelicals would not be supporting Roy Moore or this extremism in what I call Republican religionism. It's not the Orthodox evangelicalism. They try to hijack that term. White evangelicalism is connected to white nationalism, is connected to white supremacy. It is the backbone of racism that has happened in this country. Now, you understand that white nationalism, white supremacy that promotes racism. Racism is twisted. And so this notion of white evangelical values is twisted anyway, because so-called white evangelicals, I call them Republican religionists, extreme Republican religionists, are culprits in the moral defenses because they've given him and so many others cover on so many other non-Christian policies, like blocking health care is a non-Christian policy. Blocking living wages is a non-Christian policy. Blocking and suppressing voting rights is a non-Christian policy. Hating gay people and is a non-Christian policy. Promoting guns is a non-Christian policy. And so if you embolden these people by giving them support and trying to call their support on those issues Christian, then it should not surprise us that they are emboldened in this issue. So now you have people trying to compare this with Jesus and the Virgin Mary and saying that he's under some spiritual attack, like Jesus was under spiritual attack, and he's in a spiritual battle. Well, a real spiritual battle would be addressing the fact that nearly, in some counties in Alabama, 40% of the people in poverty. There are 24% of children living in households that are poverty. That's policy pedophilia. When you're hurting children and not addressing that, it's one of the lowest states in public education. You've got nearly 900,000 people in poverty, 20% of no health insurance. Those are the things that Christians should be dealing with if they were dealing with Orthodox evangelicalism. This is heretical. It's hypocritical. It's a term that they have hijacked, just like they hijacked the term the right versus the left. And we get caught up in all these terms, and they get to use these terms as though they're valid when, in fact, they're not valid anyway. Lastly, Moore himself, he got involved in trying to keep the state from overturning past segregation laws. And it was so-called the Alabama Christian Coalition But you could, just because you use the name doesn't make you Christian. There's scriptures that say people can say, Lord, Lord, but their hearts are far from him. And you've got to understand the distinct connection between so-called white evangelicalism and racism and white nationalism and white supremacy to understand how people could get this twisted in their moral aspects and their moral perspectives that is so contrary to Orthodox Christianity and Orthodox evangelicalism as it is laid out in Scripture.
Yeah, indeed. And, you know, Frank Schaeffer, you know, and that was very well said by Bishop Barber. I want to listen. I mean, Jerry Falwell Jr. has come out and said, don't believe it. You know, the same thing was done to Donald Trump. We just don't believe it. We believe Judge Moore. You have Judge Moore's brother essentially comparing Judge Moore to Jesus himself. And he says, it's kind of like when Jesus Christ was hung on the cross. King said, turn him loose. We've got nothing against him. Kill the other guy, Barabbas. Now they crucified Christ, and he never did nothing. And I'm not saying that Roy's like Christ. I'm saying the allegations, the way they're treating him, is like the way they treated Christ. They just don't want to believe that God's in control of this. I wonder, Frank, how people who call themselves evangelical Christian, evangelists of the Word of God, can say something like that and not be considered apostates. How can they say something like that?
You know, back in the day, Joy, when my dad, Francis Schaeffer, and me were barnstorming around the country establishing the religious right based on our anti-abortion stand, one I've moved a long way from since, the whole idea was bringing America back to some moral stand. But now, just think about the Republican Party right now. Let's just throw some words out that are associated with them. Mass shooting, Milo, Trump, Moore, Bannon, rape, child molesting, neo-Nazis, white supremacy. What the hell is going on with the Republican Party? I'm not shocked by Donald Trump. He's an ass. I'm not shocked by Roy Moore. He's a loudmouth, gun-toting fool. What I'm shocked by is the complicity, the enabling, what these people are doing. You know, you read the subtitle of my book, A Manifesto of Creative Redemption for the Age of Trump, Fascism, and Lies. That is not an overstatement. We are in a political climate that is built on one lie after another. I just want to say for the record, by the way, I believe Miss Korfman. I believe a woman who stands up, which is very difficult to do, and comes forward with a story like that. She was a Trump voter. She's a Republican. I believe her. I just want to say that as a father and grandfather and someone that respects women. I believe her. But let's say I didn't believe her. Let's say she was lying. What are the Republicans doing jumping to the defense of Roy Moore by saying things like, well, it's kind of like Jesus. It's kind of like Mary, who, by the way, as you noted before, I was brought up on the virgin birth, so I guess they're all Unitarians now. You know, we've got a situation. We've got a situation where the Republican Party has become complicit, and I'm going to say it again, Milo, mass shootings, Bannon, Moore, in the presidency of Donald Trump, who himself would be in jail in most states if he had been caught grabbing a woman by the crotch without her permission. That is called criminal assault. So the climate is so damn poisonous, Joy, it boggles my mind. And I left the evangelical world long ago, but I swear to God, if I was a Bible-believing, evangelical, fundamentalist Christian now who believed what my father believed, I would stand up and make the same denunciation I'm making now. This is pitiful. It is so disgusting. Yeah, period. Paragraph. That's it.
And you know, Bishop Barber, indeed, you know, because the leadership, as Frank Schaeffer just said, is completely and wholly in the tank for both Donald Trump, a self-admitted sexual assaulter of women, who's on tape bragging about it, saying he walked in on teenage girls while they were naked because it's his pageant, why can't he do it? And people dismissing it. You wind up, because the leadership level is saying that that is okay. This is an ordinary voter. Gabe Gutierrez, our NBC reporter, went down to Alabama and talked to voters, and he, oh, I'm sorry. All right, hold on a second. Let's go to Judge Roy Moore.
Okay.
For weeks, we read about my salary, which they distorted, about taxes, which they said should have been paid on money we never got, but we endured that. Later, they came about and openly endorsed my opponent in this race. Just 2 days ago, the Washington Post published yet another attack on my character and reputation in a desperate attempt to stop my political campaign for the United States Senate. These attacks involve a minor, and they're completely false and untrue about something that happened nearly 40 years ago. But more than being completely false and untrue, they're very hurtful to me personally. I've been married to my wife, Kayla, for nearly 33 years. We have 4 children. I have 1 daughter, and I have 5 granddaughters. I have the highest regard for the protection of young children. When I returned to Gadsden 40 years ago, after military service, I went to work in the office of the district attorney. As a student of the law, I have served in public office on and off for the last 40 years. To be attacked for allegations of sexual misconduct contradicts my entire career in law. I want to make it clear to the media present and to the people present, I have not provided alcoholic beverages, beer, or anything else to a minor. I have not been guilty of sexual misconduct with anyone. These allegations came only 4.5 weeks before the general election on December 12th. Why now? For 40 years, I have been closely scrutinized in the press and the public media. I've had investigations by the Attorney General. I've had investigations by the Judicial Inquiry Commission on more than one occasion. I've had investigations by the Court of the Judiciary. I've been in 5 statewide campaigns in which they do opposition research. They do investigations, as you can see in every one I've ever run. 3 county elections and 2 major controversies over religious liberty and the 10 Commandments and same-sex marriage. I've been investigated more than any other person in this country. To think that grown women would wait 40 years to come right before an election to bring charges is absolutely unbelievable. Why now? The Democrats and the Republican establishment know the importance of this election. In fact, most people in America know the importance of this election. They see it as a prelude to the elections coming in 2018. It may very well determine the future of our country. My opponent is 11 points behind. That came out just days before this article came out. They're desperate. This article is a prime example of fake news, an attempt to divert attention from the true issues which affect our country, like health care, military readiness, tax reform, immigration, and national debt. We do not intend to let the Democrats or the established Republicans or anybody else behind this story stop this campaign. There are investigations going on. In the next few days, there will be revelations about the motivations and the content of this article. They will be brought to the public. We fully expect the people of Alabama to see through this charade and to vote in the primary coming up. As Mr. Armistead said, we do not engage in negative campaigning. We haven't, and I've been blistered in articles from last 2 to 3 months on television, and it will continue. I do not expect the Washington Post to stop. I think they have a political agenda, and I think they're running that agenda, and everybody in this room, every person watching on these cameras should ask themselves, isn't it strange that after 40 years of constant investigation, people have waited to 4 weeks prior to the general election to bring their complaints? That's not a coincidence. It's an intentional act to stop a campaign. May God bless you, bless the state of Alabama, and the United States of America. Thank you.
That was Judge Roy Moore speaking to supporters in Alabama. He called the allegations against him fake news. He called his own potential election the most important political race in the country. He said that the Democrats and the Republican establishment are coming after him. He claimed also that he has been investigated, Roy Moore, more than any other person in this country. Hillary Clinton probably would like to have a word. I'm going to go around and let the panel all react to what they just heard. I'm going to start with Karine Jean-Pierre, who now really is here. You're no longer a figment of my imagination. Karine, your thoughts?
Wow, just wow. I mean, you watch him and you're just kind of like, wow, I'm wasting my time, my energy watching this guy because he's full of it. There's nothing that he's saying that's at all true. So now the Republicans were not only supporting a bigot, a racist, a known homophobe, and also a lawless individual. He got thrown off the bench twice because he wouldn't follow the letter of the law, the Constitution. Now they're supporting a pedophile. And it really is reminiscent of the Access Hollywood tape. This is exactly what happened. There was this fake distance from the Republicans. And then after a moment, after a while, when he looked like he could win, they brought him right back in. And it is just insane, but not surprising because we have a president who is a sexual predator. More than a dozen women have come out. And they put themselves on the line and said, hey, this president has sexually assaulted them. But there's another part of this too, Joy, which is the Bannon component. I mean, the Republicans are in this situation because of Bannon. And I cannot understand why you would allow a white nationalist who runs a racist website to be deciding who is going to be the U.S. senator and who's not going to be a U.S. senator. And the thing about it is Bannon is not a kingmaker. He's a blowhard.
Yeah, and he's not shown that he can do anything other than jump on a primary that was already a foregone conclusion and pretend that he created the result. I mean, there's no proof here that Bannon has any special magic electoral, skills when it comes to elections. He just is riding whatever the most, extremist, the most racist, the most sexist, the most whatever bandwagon that he thinks will grow the so-called alt-right. And he managed to trick the New York Times into running Clinton Cash, his book of conspiracy theories about Hillary Clinton, which was actually probably the one coup he really has actually pulled off.
Well, I mean, he's kind of like a P.T. Barnum-like figure in a lot of ways, a master propagandist. Before the Donald Trump election, every election that Steve Bannon put his finger on, they lost. Yeah. You go back to the 2014 Senate races, they tried to influence every single one. Kentucky, Kansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, they lost all of those. The only thing that he's done, like you said, he attaches his wagon to a horse that's already right in first place. Yeah. That's not some magic campaign voodoo. That's not he's some brilliant strategist. He's betting on the right horse at the right time, and it just so happens that it works. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. That's a Steve Bannon story.
And meanwhile, the neo-Confederate cosplayer in Virginia that was running to be the governor there lost in a primary and then decided he didn't want to help out the guy who then pretended to be a neo-Confederate and then lost as well. I mean, so just to be quick before I go to you, Judge Roy Moore said he was the most investigated man in the country. I'll just point out that his first suspension from the court, came in 2003 when Moore disobeyed a federal judge's order to take down a 5,200-pound statue of the Ten Commandments from the lobby of the state judicial building. He'd campaigned saying he was going to install the monument. So he's been thrown out, 2 failed gubernatorial bids, and then he was elected to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and then he was ousted again in 2016 permanently after he reportedly urged state judges to defy the Supreme Court's decision to legalize same-sex marriage. Because, of course, he believes that homosexuality is akin to bestiality and that it should be illegal and that it is an inherent evil against which, and you're going to love this, audience, it is an inherent evil against which children must be protected. Protector of children, Judge Roy Moore.
Yeah. The Roy Moore, who we heard yesterday speak to Sean Hannity, was a man with a very weak memory. He couldn't remember whether he dated teenagers in his 30s. He couldn't remember whether he'd met people or not met people. I mean, he had a very, very fallible memory. So for that man who's so uncertain about what he can remember and what he can't remember, to go out and deliver a statement like that today, I guess his memory's gotten a lot better in the last 12 hours. Because those are a series of categorical statements. Yesterday, when he was speaking impromptu and without a script, the statements all were punctured with escape hatches, every single one of them.
Absolutely, because he actually was trying to find a way to not avoid lying about being a 30-something-year-old man at the time who wanted to date teenagers, including having spoken in a civics class and then trying to date one of the kids. that was one of the students.
One of the phrases we all repeat is that Watergate era saying, the cover-up is worse than the crime.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, that depends what the crime is.
Depends on what the crime is. Amen. In this case, I think it is the crime. Frank Schaeffer, I want to go to you on this because the reason that this kind of politics, which involves depriving people of health care, as Bishop Barber said, which when you elect these people, you are going to get the defunding of your state's public education system. You are going to get the killing off of Medicaid for your poorest people. You're going to get policies that may even hurt these same actual voters. But this is a window into why in these red states, in places in the Deep South for the most part, but also in places like Kansas, they keep voting for these people anyway. This is a voter who spoke with our own Gabe Gutierrez in Alabama about this election. Her name is Sheila, and she's talking to Gabe.
I don't think it's true, is all I know to say is I just don't think that he did what he's being accused of.
So you plan to vote for Roy Moore in the election next month?
Yes.
What is it about him? Why do you support him?
I like his Christian beliefs and values, and his wife's.
Jesus.
Schaeffer, Frank Schaeffer, how can that be? That she's imparting Christian values onto a man who's accused of molesting a little girl?
Listen, you know, what we're watching here is a massive shift in politics, demography, but also religion. American white evangelical Christianity that I grew up in is now part of a white supremacist movement that wants to hold on to power, whether it's by gerrymandering, voter suppression, racism, white supremacy, or even violence. They know, for instance, that the gun lobby is making a fortune selling guns to people that shouldn't have them. And they will go along with this as long as it's part of their party platform that keeps them in power with the dollars that flow to candidates and the rest. We are talking about a morally bankrupt religious movement. We are talking about a country that, thank God, I think faces a hopeful future because, as a speaker before on this show said, the California trend of ethnic diversity, less racism, tolerance, accepting homosexuality as a normal human behavior. These things are on the ascendant. But this last grim, bitter clinging to power by white oligarchs, these racists, these child molesters, these buffoons, these liars, it is a pitiful thing. We are in the equivalent, and I'm not making a moral comparison, but it's like the last days of Hitler's bunker. A bunch of white generals clustered around a table, looking at maps, grimly trying to hold on to a shrinking part of Berlin as the Allies move in from all sides. That's our future. It's going to be a good future here in America. It is going to be one of creative redemption, and it's something we can look forward to. But in the meantime, God Almighty, we are facing just the lowest, scummiest moment of American history I can remember as a 65-year-old man. We've got somebody who a credible person claims is a pedophile standing up in front of a room full of people going, yeah, that's right, give it, yeah. What is he defending? A charge of pedophilia. We've got a president who tells us that anybody, 12 women, 16 women, 20 women who get together and say that he molested them, he assaulted them, they're all liars. He's going to sue them. Well, he hasn't sued them yet because he'd have to do depositions in court. And of course what they were saying is true. And so let's just look at the moment we're in. We are in a pit. This is what hell looks like, a country where people talk about morals and wave Bibles defending someone who's accused of pedophilia. That's about as low as you can get. And so this is where we are, and I've seen it in my lifetime coming from my evangelical background. I've written about it, and what we need is redemption. That's why I use the word that when I speak and when I talk and I write. Letter to Lucy's about redemption, but the point is the redemption's coming, and it's coming because of people like you, Joy, who speak up. It's coming because of people like the folks on this show here who are bringing sanity to the discussion. That's the future. This bozo in a cowboy hat is the past. Thank God for that.
Well, Frank Schaeffer, powerful words, and I need to throw it to Bishop Barber just for a follow-up on that. Bishop Barber, do we still have you?
You
still have you. Because, you know, Frank Schaeffer brought up even on the issue of guns, and I was struck last week that an op-ed in the Federalist, which we would love to know who funds the Federalist. We would love to know who their money comes from. By the way, I'll put a pin in that. Wrote an op-ed in which he said that the people inside of that Texas church in Sutherland Springs who were slaughtered by a madman who came in and shot up a church and murdered little kids, that the people who were murdered in that church had their prayers answered by God, because what God wants is for us to be delivered out of this evil world and into paradise, essentially violent martyrdom to paradise, which is what, if a Muslim imam said that, right, we would compare them to ISIS. But he says they were martyred, essentially. He wasn't ignoring their prayers. He was answering their prayers by sending them to paradise violently. That is where we are. Your thoughts?
Well, yeah, well, it's actually where we've been for quite a while, and I think that part of my concern is that we don't stop calling these people white evangelicals. You know, we don't stop calling them evangelicals because it's not Orthodox evangelical. I'm an evangelical. There are thousands and thousands of people rising up, and there's a tradition in this country of those who have taken Orthodox Christian viewpoints to fight against injustice, to stand against slavery, to stand against women being denied the right to vote, to support gay peoples, to support justice in this world. What you have is a hoax. You have a heresy, and heresy is always dangerous because it can take on the semblance of religion. That's why that young lady said Christian values. Well, all she thinks Christian values is, and I pray for her, is somebody's 10 Commandments and somebody who's against gay people, probably for the most part. The reality is, Joy, you're looking at the continual manifestation of the roots of slave master religion that was used in all kinds of ways to justify wrong. You're looking at the continual manifestation of the spiritual mobilization campaign out of the 1930s that was founded to beat back the cause of the New Deal, and big money put a lot of money behind it. The founder was James Fifield. My good friend Tom knows about this. You're looking at the same kind of religion that said that segregation was Christian. When you hear that guy talk about people in martyrdom in the church going to heaven, remember that was the same kind of language they told poor whites if you fought in the Civil War and died, it was actually a blessed kind of death. And it has been, so what we're dealing with here is an audience that has been cultivated for years, and particularly around this Roy Moore piece, for the last 50 years, from the white Southern strategy. Don't forget that Strom Thurmond, too, had a black mistress, had a child by a black woman, even though he was a racist. And so what we're seeing is a massive hoax. And the problem is, if a true Christian thought and the Orthodox Christianity locus on love and justice and mercy would not have supported Roy Moore before all of this. That's the point. Before all of this, he supported programs that hurt children. He denied health care. He denied living wages. That's what hurt children. And now on top of this, you've got all these people trying to make this right. And I often said the other day, George, what if this was Obama? What if this was you? What if this was anybody else? You watch these political people attempt to twist this and make it all right, when in fact the fact is the so-called white evangelicals, I call them Republican extreme religionists now, who are supporting this kind of backwards unchristian policies, they have actually emboldened and created a place where persons can come forth with this kind of twisted theology and believe you're going to support them no matter what, because they've been supported on so many other non-Christian pieces of public policy. And let me say this, I'm not saying this as a religious person on the left or on the right. I believe in the prophetic moral center. I'm an independent by registration, a voter registration. We are seeing a non-Christian movement being perpetrated as a massive hoax on the American public, and it is as old as the magicians of Pharaoh against Moses, the prophets, as old as the Pharisees against Jesus, as old as what Frederick Douglass called the slave master's religion versus the religion of Christ. And if we don't understand that it's always been a part of the American construct, then we misinterpret, and our analysis is not deep enough.
Yeah, and indeed. And on that note, I want to bring in Jason Johnson, who is the politics editor of TheRoot.com. You write a lot about these issues because at a certain point, what I think a lot of people don't understand, Jason, is how raw self-interest doesn't overcome this. These are the same people who are cutting out health care, who are taking away living wages, who are denying minimum wage increases, who are saying we will leave you poorer. We refuse to let you have higher wages. You cannot have health care or Medicaid. The same people who are saying we will now boldly cut the richest people's taxes and raise yours so that we can afford it for them. When does raw self-interest overcome this decamping to a religious sort of diktat that doesn't even fit the sort of plain text of the Bible.
It never does, Joy. And that's the thing that I think people, sometimes on the left and even on the right, don't seem to understand. You know, I'm a political scientist, and everyone always says, you know, people vote their pocketbooks. No, they don't. They vote their values. They will eat their values. They will starve with their values. And their values drive everything they do. You go back to George Wallace. When I talked about policy, it didn't work. When I started talking about black people, that's when they start stamping their feet. So that's what drives this. That's what drives the people who support Roy Moore. It's not just religion. It's also they hate women. You have to fundamentally hate women to not believe a 14-year-old girl that says I was assaulted because this guy goes trolling for dates at custody hearings when he's a lawyer, right? So, I think the key to this is, look, we've always had this element in society. We've always had sick people. We've always had loathsome people. Now they have a sign. Now they have a guidepost in the President of the United States. And what we have to recognize is that, hey, we're in a free country. Everybody can have that belief system. Let's stop trying to convince those people to join the rest of moral society and instead function on uplifting and supporting those people who recognize what the future needs to be.
Yeah, and by the way, Democrats vote their values and not their pocketbooks either. If you live in New York, or you live in New Jersey, or you live in Connecticut, you are affirmatively voting to raise your own taxes constantly.
Right. Exactly.
Because the values of the party that you prefer are more important to you than your pocketbook. I mean, neither party vote their pocketbook, right? Really.
Yeah, and that's always been the case. And it's this myth that, you know, it's driven by the economy. Look, you know, the economy could be terrible next year, and you will still have tons of people who will vote for Donald Trump.
That is correct.
People can look at this tax plan and realize it's, you know, how many different pointless, cloying stories can we read about poor Ohioans? And I was an Ohio voter saying, yeah, I didn't think Trump was really going to take all this stuff from me, but I'm going to vote for him anyway.
That's exactly it's preposterous. Or I know he's not bringing back coal, and I don't care.
I don't care.
We keep having the New York Times and everyone else going down to these Rust Belt cities and trying to sort of figure out what it is that peels these folks away. They will say, we know he's not reopening the factory. I'm getting laid off, and I still support him.
And I've said this, it's a piece, it's literally, I have it pinned on Twitter. Trump's supporters will never, ever leave him. They never will, under any circumstances. And the reason why there's core, because I think his core party, the core support that he has, you know, that 25, that 30%, they're nihilists. They already think America is done. They already think this country is over. They just want to go down swinging.
Yeah.
And he's their temper tantrum.
And I'm going to go back really quickly just to, I want to get everybody else in, but there is an apocalyptic element to it, Frank Schaeffer. There's a sense that they're already in this cosmic struggle, that speeding toward the apocalypse. So I think that to a certain extent, Jason is right. There are people for whom these economic issues just are so secondary to that apocalyptic vision anyway.
Yeah, if you look at the theology of some of the white evangelicals that support Trump, let's start with him because that's the big story. Their vision of the future is a very grim one, and essentially their idea is that they are a persecuted remnant of true believers, and now you mix in a racial element after an 8-year black presidency that denies everything that their core racist beliefs hold on to. What Reverend Barber was talking about, this kind of slave master theology, that has been denied in a documentary sense to them that has enraged them. And so I completely agree. Their view is not to build a healthy future. Look, the healthy future is sitting around that table with you. There are black faces there. There are white faces there. There are Asian faces. You've got one token old white fart here who repents his past right-wing stupidity. But that said, I look at what's around your table and I say, if two lines were forming, I would be running in that direction. That's the healthy, hopeful, redemptive future, and you've got it sitting at that table with you.
Absolutely.
But here's a more challenging message, and it's one. Jason's, of course, right. You never change the mind of the base. No one ever loses elections because of the base. The way you win elections is by moving people from the middle.
Yeah.
And this is what you're going to see happening or not happening in Alabama, which is Roy Moore's a weak candidate. If the National Democratic Party had let Doug Jones run as a moderate, not a liberal, the seat would be winnable.
We'll see. We'll see. That race is essentially tied. David Frum, Kurt Bardella, Jason Johnson, Frank Schaeffer, Bishop William Barber, Caton Dawson. Karina's going to be back. Thank you, guys. Great panel. And up next, more AM Joy. Absolutely did not meddle in our election. He did not do what they're saying he did. Every time he sees me, he says, I didn't do that. And I believe. I really believe when he tells me that. I really believe that he tells me that. He means it. But he says, I didn't do that. I think he's very insulted by it. It's very hard to read Donald Trump's words because the syntax. Joining me now is MSNBC national security analyst Evelyn Farkas, former federal prosecutor Paul Butler, Malcolm Nance, executive director of the Terror Asymmetrics Project, Sarah Kendzior, journalist and scholar of authoritarian states, as well as Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell, who sits on the House Intelligence Committee. I just made you a senator, Congressman Swalwell, but I'm going to go to you first anyway in your former capacity as a congressman. Donald Trump, did you think that you would live to see the day? I'll phrase it this way. When the President of the United States would take the word of former KGB agent and Russian autocrat Vladimir Putin over the word of his own U.S. intelligence services?
Joy, it just makes you ask, who is he not willing to betray over this issue, as long as it perpetuates the myth that Russia had nothing to do with electing him. He's betrayed the intelligence community who put the report together. He's now betrayed, I think, his oath to protect and defend our country and our Constitution, and he's siding with a foreign adversary. It is an absolute betrayal, and I think it's just a devastating message to those who toil away here in the United States and abroad to protect our country, that he is siding with Vladimir Putin and taking him just at his word.
What do you expect to hear from your colleagues on the other side of the aisle in response to that? Because normally, the Republican Party for a long time have felt that they owned these national security issues. They were the party that was for, peace through strength during the Reagan era. Now you have a Republican president of the United States siding with a foreign adversary over these intelligence services that work so hard and defend this country. Do you expect to hear any outrage or umbrage from the other side of the aisle?
Joy, I don't have to predict what they're going to do, because I saw just this past week what they will do. We were in a Judiciary Committee hearing, and we were legislating around the Section 702, that's foreign surveillance. It was our first time in a long time to update that, and taking a lesson learned from our own investigation into the Russian interference. I wrote legislation that said if we observe any foreigners trying to meddle in our elections, we immediately have to notify Congress. I wrote this because I think one of the failures of the Obama administration was they didn't tell Congress soon enough, they didn't tell the public soon enough, and I thought this is one way to make sure that Congress knows as soon as something like this were to happen again. Every single Republican voted against it, and the chairman of the committee said that he wouldn't support it because it was a partisan amendment. Joy, I asked him, I said, what is partisan about just wanting to know if foreigners are meddling in our election? I'm afraid that they've just really buried their head in the sand because any talk of election interference they think is delegitimizing a president.
I want to, it is pretty striking, Evelyn, that you do now have this sort of partisan, you now have to put partisanship in the mix when you talk about questions of basic national security.
Yeah.
Did you ever think you'd see the day when an American president would side with Vladimir Putin, former KGB agent Vladimir Putin, over the American intelligence services?
Never. So my last job was in the Obama administration. I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, responsible for Russia and the kind of successor states of that region, Eastern Europe, et cetera. And we had Republicans and Democrats, I mean, I think understanding what the policy was towards Russia, we didn't have a breakdown along party lines. Now, we got it a little bit wrong because we thought we could cooperate with Russia. We didn't understand that Vladimir Putin was going to really be an adversary to the point where he would do a high-risk operation against the United States elections. We didn't get that. But once that became public, once we knew that, I mean, I continue to be shocked that the president can maintain this position that somehow the intelligence community is wrong.
Yeah.
You know, the only people who know what Russia did are the Russian intelligence agents and our intelligence agents, you know, and so it's appalling to me that they try to dismiss it. The Russians, of course, their modus operandi is just keep going, pretend nothing happened. Yeah. But they lie about everything. I mean, they're in violation of a nuclear treaty with us right now. They lied about invading Crimea in Ukraine and then later admitted it, not too far afterwards. They lied about what they were doing in the rest of eastern Ukraine. You know, Putin lies time and time again. There's no reason to believe him.
Very quickly before I move on, I want to put a pin in something that the congressman just said. Should the Obama administration have been more aggressive about telling the public about what they knew was going on in terms of Russian interference, even though I'll make the point that Republicans like Mitch McConnell threatened the White House that if you go forward, we're going to say you're just trying to swing the election.
Right. I mean, I think what I was worried about, because I was no longer in government during this time period, but what I was worried about was that the Obama administration was not informing Congress Congress in the fullest fashion that they could.
Yep.
It turns out that they were, and at least on one side of the aisle, they weren't interested in hearing the truth, right? So I think that's a bigger issue. Telling the public, yes, I think the public needed to know more, and I would have advocated, had I been in the administration, for telling the public more. But, you know, I do also understand the various things that they were juggling in the White House, the various other considerations. They didn't want to make it seem political. Etc.
Yeah, other countries.
And Donald Trump, Joy, Donald Trump had said that the election was going to be rigged, and to the Obama administration's credit, they didn't want to play into that bogus claim.
Yeah, I totally get that. I want to go to Malcolm Nance really quickly because this Russian operation, and you said it time and time again, was incredibly successful in that they managed to place as National Security Advisor of the United States somebody who had taken a check from Russia, taken a check from the leadership there in Russia. And it also turned out that Michael Flynn was taking checks from other folks. And this is a pretty shocking story. It is a news story, but it turns out that Robert Mueller is investigating former White House National Security Advisor Mike Flynn's alleged role in a plot essentially to kidnap, to forcibly remove a Muslim cleric living in the United States and rendition him to Turkey in return for millions of dollars, according to people familiar with the investigation. Both this cleric is named Fethullah Gulen. He's a political rival of the Turkish president, the autocrat Tayyip Erdogan. Lawyers for Flynn have dismissed the allegations as false, but both Flynn and his son are essentially accused of a kidnapping plot for cash that he would have been plotting while the sitting National Security Advisor of the United States. Malcolm Nance, your thoughts?
Well, it's simple. I mean, if this is proven, if it's borne out, you're going to see the indictments very soon. And what I think you'll see is the former Director of Defense Intelligence, the former National Security Advisor to the United States, arrested for participating in a plot to abduct a U.S. resident and rendition him privately for money to a foreign power. And, you know, this goes hand in hand with everything else that was going on with Mike Flynn and his son, his involvement with Russia, his seeming involvement with the Russian foreign minister when we were kicking out spies from the United States. This is so incredible that what we have here, and it goes to Donald Trump's remarks to Vladimir Putin, we have moved so far away from them being a whole bunch of innocents abroad and just, you know, looking out for their own personal interests that I'm really flabbergasted. I really think that we are at a national level Benedict Arnold moment going on here. We have a president literally on Veterans Day insulting the entirety of U.S. intelligence and siding with a former director of the KGB, FSB. But, you know, all of this together, taken as one team, shows me that there was a continuing criminal enterprise, and Russia is at the center of it. And the president has violated his oath by maintaining this fraud that none of this is true. And when it's borne out, it's going to be well past impeachable.
Yes, indeed. I want to thank Malcolm Nance. I think we are losing Malcolm's satellite. He is overseas, and that was the reason for that bit of a delay. So, Malcolm Nance, I'm going to thank you and move on to our panel. I want to go to Sarah Kendzior on this question of Vladimir Putin being able to say to the President of the United States, no, I didn't do it. I didn't interfere in the election. And that's good enough for the President of the United States on Veterans Day. Your thoughts?
I mean, it's, you know, it's the same thing that Trump has been doing and that Putin have been doing from the beginning, you know, which is continually lying about this while also being quite blatant, you know, and quite audacious in their proclamations, such as last year when, you know, Trump asked, you know, Putin to give the hacked Hillary Clinton emails to him to help him, promised he'd be rewarded, to things he's done in office, like bringing, you know, Russian representatives into the Oval Office and giving state secrets. I mean, there's no shame here. There's no sense of propriety. There's no sense of legality. There's just, you know, the audacity of an autocrat, and he thinks that he'll get away with it. So, you know, yeah, I think, you know, Malcolm said it well. We're well at the point, past the point of a, you know, typical impeachment process. We're at a historical juncture.
And, you know, Paul Butler, you know, the question is whether or not this is merely distasteful And I think particularly to any veteran, it should be distasteful that the American president would side with a foreign autocrat over the intelligence services that work hard every day to protect this country. You know, whatever people will individually think of the CIA or the NSA and their history, you know, these are professionals that are working, and they are Americans, and at minimum side with the Americans over the Russian. But maybe he doesn't want to do that. Yeah. But the question is whether or not any of it is criminal, and whether or not there is going to be criminal liability attached, both to Donald Trump himself, to people like Michael Flynn, who apparently had this kidnapping plot. You go down and you go to Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary of the United States, who has his own ties to Putin's cronies. The Commerce Secretary retained investments in a shipping firm with business ties directly to Vladimir Putin's inner circle. He also led a private bailout of the Bank of Cyprus, which has long been regarded as a financial haven for wealthy Russians. After the worldwide economic crisis crippled the Cypriot banking system, you have senior members of this administration with ties to Putin. You have Trump with ties and believes Putin. At what point does the distasteful cross into criminal?
When they lie about it, when they fail to reveal it when they're asked, when they swear under oath that it didn't happen. And so, yes, the Russians lie. Guess who else is lying? Pretty much every Trump campaign operative who is asked, did you have contact with the Russians, says no. And then we find out it's not true. So this week it's Carter Page. Last week it was George Papadopoulos, Sessions, Trump Jr., Kushner. The question is, why are these people not revealing what's going on with the Russians? The strategy of the special counsel was to make this pattern of everybody covering up, not disclosing their meetings with the Russians, and then with Trump, why is he lying? Again, he was able to say that no one in my campaign contacted the Russians. There were never any discussions. We know that is absolutely not true. The question is, what's Trump trying to cover up? Or is he just so clueless that he doesn't know that his campaign officials are doing this highly unorthodox thing of meeting with Russians to try to elect Donald Trump as the next president of the United States?
And we do have one instance, you know, Paul, in which Donald Trump is personally intervening to fix the story of his son as to why he's taking that meeting with somebody who then turns out to have been using talking points that were connected to talking points in Russia, and in which they were supposedly being promised dirt on Hillary Clinton. And I think the question for a lot of people who watch the show, a lot of people who, you know, who tune in, is at what point does the criminal liability attach to him? There are lots of people who seem to be in some trouble. Paul Manafort seems to be in trouble. Michael Flynn and his son, they seem to be in trouble. Maybe even Jared Kushner, who knows? At what point does Trump have the liability, and can he be prosecuted for any of this?
Yeah, so again, I think Special Counsel Mueller is very seriously looking at obstruction of justice charges. So Steve Mueller, who's in the White House now, had a little sit down to talk about this letter that he ginned up about why Comey should be fired. And apparently it was too transparent because it admitted that it was about the Russians. So the White House counsel said, no, that's not a go. And that's when they made this move of going to Rod Rosenstein at the Justice Department to come up with another reason. So again, if you're trying to impede an investigation about Russian interference in your campaign, that's a federal crime.
Yeah.
So what Comey is, what Mueller is doing now.
So many of them.
There are.
And then there's the question on the national security side. Obviously, there's nothing that anybody can really do about it. But does the intelligence service, do the intelligence services at some point push back and say, wait a minute, we're right here?
They should, but the problem is that you've seen Pompeo be very cautious, and so with the head of the CIA director, he's been very cautious, and frankly speaking, the DNI, Mr. Coates, Dan Coates, former Senator Coates, he's also very quiet. So we don't really see them pushing back and publicly, at least, defending the intelligence community. Hopefully, they're doing it in private.
And in fact, Pompeo, the CIA director, was meeting with a conspiracy theorist who was giving an alternate theory to the interference. I want to end with the congressman, because we know there's not going to be impeachment. We know that your colleagues on the other side aren't interested in doing that. Should Democrats be more explicitly pitching to voters that your party needs control of the House of Representatives in order for there to ever be a meaningful investigation of Russiagate?
Yes, Joy, and the American people are with us. A poll came out earlier in the week that showed over 65% of the country is concerned about President Trump and his contacts with Russia. And I think if we pitch this to the American people, that this is not about the last election, it's about our freedom to choose in the next one, and that we will have the checks and balances to make sure that we hold this administration accountable and that we always protect our democracy, I think they're going to give us the responsibility to lead. Of course, we have to, supplement supplement that with health care and make sure that we're on their side when it comes to, middle-class tax cuts. But I really do believe this freedom to choose is what this is about, and they're with us. We just have to make sure that we show them we're for them.
Yeah, I would suspect that the majority of the American people believe American intelligence services over Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump is not among them. Evelyn Farkas, Paul Butler, Sarah Kendzior, Congressman Eric Swalwell, thank you very much. Appreciate you all, and thanks to Malcolm as well. And up next, the great Lawrence O'Donnell joins me live. You do not want to miss that.
I've been investigated more than any other person in this country. To think that grown women would wait 40 years to come right before an election to bring charges is absolutely unbelievable.
Here to help me fact-check Roy Moore's defense this morning is my friend Lawrence O'Donnell, who has a great new book entitled Playing with Fire, the 1968 election and the transformation of American politics, in which he answers the question of whether Donald Trump's election was the most unusual in history with a big old no. He is not. Lawrence O'Donnell, thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
First of all, great book. We're going to get into the book in just a second. We're going to talk about that, but I have to talk to you about Roy Moore. Last night on The Last Word, as everybody who watches the show already saw, you went through the attempts by Sean Hannity to save him from himself and the failure of it to save him. What do you make of Roy Moore's defense this morning?
Well, he didn't offer any real defense this morning, but what he did was, it's been clarified to him. Actually, Sean Hannity, I think, clarified it for him for the first time in his life, that in Sean Hannity's world, it is weird and inappropriate, to put it mildly, for a 32-year-old assistant district attorney to be dating 17-year-olds and 16-year-olds and 18-year-olds. And Roy Moore had actually admitted to dating them in the Sean Hannity interview before Sean told him, I don't like that. I have daughters that age, and I wouldn't like that. And then Roy Moore went, oh, okay, I wouldn't like it either. So there are two different interviews that Sean Hannity did yesterday. One before the commercial break and one after the commercial break. You might call it the recess if it was a courtroom. And so, lawyers do what they do during the recess. They figure out how they're going to rehabilitate their witness. So Roy Moore, before the recess, before the commercial, said, for example, of Debbie Gibson, I knew her as a friend. I knew her as a friend. You know how he met his friend? In her high school civics class, where someone thought it's a good idea, civics class, let's bring in local assistant district attorney to talk about the court system. Great idea. Unless it's Roy Moore, because he's going to ask a 17-year-old out on a date. That's how he knew her. And he was using Debbie Gibson's story about them dating when she was 17, having met him in her high school civics class, using her story about saying that they didn't have sex, because that's her story, they did not have sex, and saying, look, she contradicts the 14-year-old who says that we did have sex. Yeah. In the first part of the interview, he used every other part of the Washington Post story as fact to contradict the 14-year-old. Sean then comes back from the commercial and leads him through this thing about, dating teenagers when you're 32 is inappropriate, and only then does he say, well, I don't really recall dating them. So unfortunately, a lot of people are reducing this interview to, I don't recall dating them. That's not true. He did recall dating them. He said, I dated a lot of young ladies. Before he knew he wasn't supposed to say that. Before his lawyer, Sean Hannity, could kind of tell him, don't say that.
Yeah, maybe don't say that. I'm old enough to remember that Gary Hart was turfed out of a presidential campaign for merely having a woman, not his wife, sitting on his lap on the monkey business. When Larry Craig was turfed out of Congress for having his foot touch another man's foot in a bathroom stall. How do we go from infidelity, the hint of infidelity, or the suggestion of it in a photo being enough to end your political career, to people in Alabama saying, even if it's true that he had sex with a 14-year-old, raped or assaulted a 14, I don't care.
Because up to the age of Trump, politicians did not get the presumption of innocence ever. That was restricted to courtrooms. And so the benefit of the doubt never went to a politician, because we have been schooled, I think rather wisely, to, as a fundamental default point, do not believe politicians.
Right.
You know, don't believe every word the car dealer says. Do not believe politicians. And so whenever they approach the doubt zone, the voter always used to go the other way. And now, in this age, you have to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. If you don't have videotape of Donald Trump doing what he personally confessed to doing as a sexual assaulter, if you don't have that videotape, Donald Trump gets the benefit of the doubt from that minority of voters who were able to get him through the electoral
college. And I wonder if he had video. I'm not sure. This is, you know, in addition to the very famous Access Hollywood tape in which Donald Trump admits that he just goes up and starts kissing women and then feels that he can grab them by the genitalia because he's famous. Even before that, Donald Trump admitted to peeping at teenage girls when they were naked because he had a pageant. This is Donald Trump admitting that he peeps at naked teenage girls on the Howard Stern Show. Take a listen.
Well, I'll tell you the funniest is that I'll go backstage before a show. Yes. And everyone's getting dressed and ready and everything else. And, you know, no men are anywhere. And I'm allowed to go in because I'm the owner of the pageant, and therefore I'm inspecting it. You know, I'm inspecting. I want to make sure that everything is good.
You're there.
Yeah, the dress. Is everyone okay? You know, they're standing there with no clothes. Is everybody okay? And you see these incredible-looking women. And so I sort of get away with things like that.
Okay, so you have that, you know, I mean, so we have this cultural problem, too. You have James Woods, who went after a movie about gay people and then had his memory refreshed, that he tried to proposition teenage, very young girls. So there's a cultural problem that we obviously see with the Hollywood scandals, et cetera, but there is this particular cultural problem of these men thinking that girls 14, 15, 16, 17 are eligible.
Well, Donald Trump was the Roy Moore of beauty pageants. Imagine if Roy Moore could have been in Donald Trump's position. Roy Moore is working the high school civics class, and Donald Trump gets to walk in when these teenage girls are dressing during a beauty pageant. And listen, that world laughed their way through that, along with, you know, the Stern Show reaction. And, you know, and to put the Stern Show in context, Howard Stern did not think he was interviewing a politician. Sure. He thought he was interviewing a show business wise guy. Yeah. And so that's the context of the segment he thought he was in. And it turns out this was revealing a truth about Donald Trump that, as I say, that minority of voters who were properly positioned geographically to get him through the Electoral College are okay with that.
Absolutely. I want to talk about this book, Playing with Fire, because 1968, I personally think, is the most momentous and interesting year in American history. Obviously, you agree because you wrote a book about it. You know, I think about George Wallace a lot when I think about Donald Trump. Is he comparable to Wallace? Or is he something different?
Well, George Wallace, his campaign manager, is in this book telling me that when he listened to Donald Trump campaigning, he was listening to Wallace on every level, on the voter he was appealing to, on the racially coded language that he was using to appeal to them. Because, you know, Wallace said in 1967, when he was gearing up for his independent campaign for 1968, he said, having been steamrolled by the Kennedys in integrating University of Alabama, when he was a staunch segregationist, he said, I don't talk about segregation anymore, I talk about law and order. And Nixon heard that, and a couple of months later, Nixon was talking about law and order. Every Republican candidate since then is the law and order candidate. But Wallace did something in his rallies that no one had ever seen before, and the next time we saw it was Donald Trump. And that was whenever he got these liberal, and as he would call them, commie protesters in the audience, he would always attack them very directly and fight with them very directly, because he loved showing his supporters how tough he is. And if you put him in there, he's going to fight the people who you hate. And so the Wallace campaign was about hate in both directions. It was about you know, Wallace expressing the hatred of the other side that his voters felt. Trump did exactly the same thing. You would see a protester at a Trump rally, and very quickly Trump caught on to, oh, This is the good part of the rally. This is the part where I get to say, I want to punch him in the face. That was pure Wallace. They're taken right out. And not that Trump has the vaguest notion of history and that it had been done before. He had exactly the same sense of kind of vulgar showmanship that Wallace did.
And we're running out of time, but I just want to very quickly ask you, part of what made this such an insane sort of wild election, and the way you tell it in the book really is, it is a page turner because it was a wild election, but the president of the United States choosing not to run. Can you foresee Donald Trump doing that?
Yes. We'd never seen it before. And Johnson was heavily favored when he decided to just drop out because he was challenged on the left by Gene McCarthy, Bobby Kennedy, and just couldn't figure out how to deal with Bobby Kennedy mostly. The next time we may see this is Donald Trump just saying, I can't take it. And LBJ was a much tougher, more ruthless politician than Donald Trump could ever be, and he dropped out.
And at least he knew to be privately vulgar instead of publicly vulgar. Lawrence O'Donnell signed my book. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for your kind words on the back of this book.
Absolutely, yes. I endorsed it on the back, but it is a fantastic book. So don't forget to check it out. It is called Playing with Fire, the 1968 Election, the Transformation of American Politics. And you already watched the last word, so I don't have to tell you guys that. And up next, can Democrats keep their winning streak going into 2018? And will Dan Rather will be here. I thought Will be here. He will be here to talk about what unites us. Wow, things unite us. Stay with us. Democrats are eyeing the 2018 midterms with renewed optimism after Tuesday's elections gave them reason for hope for the first time in an entire year. Ralph Northam's victory in the Virginia gubernatorial race was the big prize in the state, where Democrats also picked up 15 seats in the House of Delegates, which, with 4 races still too close to call, puts them within spitting distance of wresting back control of the chamber. Tuesday's blue wave swept across the country, with Democrats winning the governor's seat and control of the government entirely in New Jersey, and after winning a key state Senate race, control of the government in Washington state. The party also put wins on the board in a series of local races. Among the newly elected Democrats are a number of historic firsts for women, people of color, and transgender candidates. None of which means that it's time for Democrats to pop the champagne cork yet, because it means that it remains to be seen if they can continue to ride that wave right into 2018. And joining me now, Judith Brown-Dianis, Executive Director with the Advancement Project, National Office, and former DNC Chair Howard Dean, and Democratic pollster Fernand Amandi. Thank you all for being here. I have to go to Howard Dean first. I have to go to Howard Dean first, even though I usually do ladies first. But I wonder what lessons do you think the Democratic Party took out of Tuesday, Howard Dean, and are they the right lessons?
There were a bunch of them, and I think they most likely were the right lessons. They can only tell what they do with the lessons. So the first is that there is a substantial sort of decency about the American people, that they are not going to put up with a lot of the stuff that Trump and the Republicans have been trying to get away with. It is a swing state, but to win by 9 points, which Northam did, is extraordinary. The second lesson is most of the grassroots stuff in the down-ballot races, like all the delegate races, that happened because of the under 35, under 40 generation mobilizing, and that's the really key to the future of the Democratic. And these kids are not Democrats. They are people who believe what the Democrats believe in, but they're not institution lovers. They build their own, and our trick and our challenge is to get them to see themselves as part of the institution that creates these kinds of values in the country.
And Judith, I wonder if, Democrats noticed the demographic outcome, because despite the fact that you did have, to Howard Dean's point, this sort of big wave of liberal voters, of Democratic voters, of young voters, there's a particular kind of voter that voted more Democratic than everyone else as usual. Black women went 91% for Northam over Gillespie. Black men went 81-17 for Northam, 10 points lower than black women. White women, on the other hand, went 51-48 for Gillespie, and white men went 63-36 for Gillespie. And I haven't seen the full breakdowns, but I suspect that even when you go down the age scale from voters over 60 all the way down to voters under 30, for white voters, there's still a preponderance of Republicans. So I'm wondering if Democrats have noticed that it's voters of color that keep carrying them over the finish line, because what I don't see, frankly, a lot of Democrats doing is registering more voters of color, or registering voters at all.
Right. Well, they better get the memo.
Or fighting voter suppression.
Right, they better get the memo. I mean, how many times do they have to see black women coming out in record numbers, turning out for Hillary Clinton, now in Virginia, and that's for a moderate Democrat who was running. But the other thing is that down ballot, right? So you have all of these wins, like the black woman who won in Charlotte, right? A black man who won in Minnesota, in St. Paul, Minnesota. Black voters handled their business. It's up to the DNC to figure out whether or not they're going to lean into the diversity of their party and embrace it, and also know that black people voted against Trump, what he stands for, and against white supremacy, because we don't want to go backwards. And so they're going to have to recognize that that's what people want, and people want new kinds of candidates, not the same old candidates that the DNC has been putting up.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was an incredible variety. I think there were 3 trans candidates. I think all 3 might have won, including in Minnesota. I mean, there was a real diversity. I think we might have lost for non-satellite, so I'm going to go back to Howard Dean just for a moment. Because the thing the reason I asked you that question is that I get the sense that the DNC is very much interested in conversion, meaning that they would very much like, please, to go to Trump voters and convert them, or convert what normally are Republican voters, like white suburban women, and have them convert over to become Democrats. And yet, Politico did put out a poll on Thursday that said of Trump voters, 82%, 8 in 10, said that they would vote for him again if they could do it over, knowing everything they know now. I feel like the return on investment, the Democrats don't necessarily see bigger ROI in investing in community of color than they do in conversion. Am I wrong about that?
I think so. I think the DNC, look, the DNC is an inside the Beltway organization. They did have 40 people in Virginia. I mean, they did their piece. But the real heavy lift among African-American and Latino voters in particular were Color of Change, which did a great job organizing, and Voto Latino, Latins Vote. Those organizations, and there were others, but you know, the interesting thing about this is you can criticize the DNC and they'll say the right things, but the real change of all of this is coming from the grassroots. And there are grassroots organizations of color that are unbelievably effective, which need to be properly funded.
Yeah, I just was with one last night, Black Girls Vote, which is incredible. They're in Maryland. Right. They are registering voters. They registered over, I believe, 11,000 voters. Right. They've only been at it for like a couple of years. Right. So there are these smaller grassroots organizations. Right. They can, you know, they're a small organization with not a ton of money, but they're actually out there registering the voters who vote for progressive policies.
Right. Registering them, developing relationships with people. There's a group called Black PAC that was heavily in Virginia.
Oh, absolutely.
New Virginia Majority. The work that Advancement Project did for years trying to restore the right to vote for people with felony convictions in Virginia made a difference. And so that's what we have to understand. It's not just going to be about the party. It's going to be about these groups who are engaging people beyond elections, but in everyday issues that people care about, that are going to be the ones to be able to push the Dems over. But again, only if the Democrats understand that racial justice issues are important to people, that bread and butter issues are important to people, and that they have to lean in to diverse candidates across the country that are down ballot.
And Howard Dean, I think really quickly, the other thing, well, I don't think we have time, but healthcare was the other big issue. I mean, Medicaid expansion going through in Maine is a huge deal. Leaning into healthcare probably isn't a bad idea. I'll give you like 2 seconds to respond.
You're absolutely right. Healthcare drives everybody, including some Trump voters who will not vote for Trump the second time. But when you look, again, to get back to the point about the diversity, this is not going to come from the Democratic Party down. It's going to come from the grassroots up, and it is incredibly successful. Imagine Black Lives Matter getting somebody elected to the district attorney's office in Philadelphia. I mean, it's going to happen. And the Democrats, we're going to be there. We're just not going to take the lead, because we don't have to take the lead. Finally, communities of color are actually taking their own lead, and they're going to be successful. And what we have to do as allies is support them, not try to take the lead, support them.
And remember that, you know, the Democrats do tend to get about 4 in 10 white voters, so it's a diverse coalition. We'll bring these guys back. Sorry we lost Fernand Satellite, but Judith Brown Dianis and Howard Dean, thank you both. Appreciate it. And up next, one of the giants of TV news, the great Dan Rather, joins me live. And tomorrow, Donna Brazile. Tea will be spilled. Don't go away.
We've defended other nations' borders.
while leaving ours wide open. Anybody can come in. Oh, we're going to build the wall. Don't worry about it. We're building the wall. Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, get that son of a off the field right now, out, he's fired. A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are. They are the enemy of the people.
In the years since Donald Trump was elected, his attacks on immigration, the press, and freedom of speech have threatened many of the ideals and core principles of this country. Legendary journalist Dan Rather examines some of these American principles in his new book, What Unites Us? Reflections on Patriotism. And the great Dan Rather joins me now. I have coveted your presence on this show for so long, Dan. Thank you so much for being here. Great to talk to you.
Oh, it's great to see you, Joy. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, you know, you start your book because you are an intellectual with a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville that says, the greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but in her ability to repair her faults. Do you think that that America has shown such ability when we seem to have swung so quickly from having, you know, exalted and electing the first black president to electing the likes of Donald Trump, given his character?
Well, I understand it's sometimes hard to see because there's an ebb and flow to politics. But, you know, the reason I wanted to do this book, Joy, quite frankly, was to give some hope and inspiration about the country in at least some microscopic way. The tone and temper of the current presidency has confused some people. It's angered a lot of people. So we need to keep in mind that, you know, we are a steady people. We go through unsteady periods. This is definitely an unsteady period. But if we just hold on and remind ourselves of our history, you know, the 1960s were very divisive, and we finally got through that and steadied ourselves. Certainly the Great Civil War in the 1800s was catastrophic. That we're basically a steady people. And I have a chapter in the book in What Unites Us, pointing out that steadiness is one of the things that unites us. Now, I think we began to see some signs of a new steadiness last Tuesday, not because the Democrats won. You can read it that way, but another way of reading it is the country having oscillated, if you will, pretty far right with the election and what President Trump has done with his elective office. The country is, I think, steadying itself. Now, I do think there's some danger of the Democrats celebrating a little too early. And I'm not so much worried about Democrats, Republicans, or the party. Most Americans see themselves as they want people in office who are doing what's good for the country, not for their party and not for their own political benefit. So, you know, this is one small voice, United We Stand, pointing out that we better unite because that's how we stand. If we listen to these voices of divisiveness, which is basically what the president has been preaching, he did so in his campaign, and he's done so in his presidency, then we're going to slide from patriotism into some form of extreme nationalism, which can lead to nativism and tribalism. And if we go that way, I don't think we will. As you know, Joe, I'm an optimist by nature and by experience. But if we go that way, then we will not have the kind of country we have now. I think that's what people are seeing, and that's the reason I think that in the ebb and flow of our politics, things are flowing back a bit more toward civility, steadiness, and a spirit of let's finally get something done rather than shout at one another, particularly shout in terms of bigotry.
And you know, Dan, this is a country obviously was formed out of the idea of separating from the king, and yet the presidency has really morphed into a very larger-than-life, almost a sort of personality cult at certain points when you've had a president that's had a strong personality. Donald Trump has taken that to an extreme sort of almost autocratic level in a lot of ways. This is Donald Trump talking to Laura Ingraham on her show about the fact that he has not built up the State Department as the arm that, you know, speaks to the world for the United States. Take a listen.
Well,
the one that matters is me. I'm the only one that matters because when it comes to it, that's what the policy is going to be.
I mean, you started with de Tocqueville. That's l'état c'est moi. That's Napoleonic. I mean, how do you have a country that's united when the president sees himself as almost a king-like figure, and therefore those who do not worship the king cannot possibly unite with those who do?
Here's how we do it. First of all, remembering no president is stronger than the country as a whole. That's number one. Number two is just say no. Listen, in our system of government, the American presidency makes the president both the head of state and the head of government, which gives him immense power, but it also gives him a tremendous amount of responsibility. Americans, from the very beginning, you know, we don't believe in having a head of government or a head of state, never mind a combined one, who's seen as a descendant of some god or some autocratic figure. And the answer to what you just saw President Trump say some time ago, that, well, he decides, oh, we don't need much of a State Department, the answer is just say no.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, Dan Rather, it's always such a treat to talk to you, such an honor. Dan Rather's new book, thank you so much, sir, is What Unites Us? Reflections on Patriotism. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you, Dan. And be sure to check out my Daily Beast column along some hopeful lines as well. Finally, the real majority pushes back against the bitter third. That's my current column at the Daily Beast. I want to give a shout out to Black Girls Vote. I had the pleasure of delivering their keynote address. This is some of the swag that I got. It's very cute at their first annual celebration in Baltimore last night. The grassroots organization focuses on encouraging young women of color to participate in the democratic process. They're already working hard to prepare for the 2018 midterms. Nikesha and company, you guys do a great job. Thank you very much for having me. That's our show for today. Join us tomorrow for more AM Joy, 10 a.m. Eastern on MSNBC. In the meantime, keep it right here on MSNBC. Plug.